Who saw this one coming? As a self-contained spin-off to the Borderlands series, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands takes one of the more charming characters from its universe and invites us on a Dungeons & Dragons style detour. The idea is undeniably cute. Think of Borderlands FPS mechanics seen through the lens of a D&D campaign, but at its core, well, this is still an extension of the same custom Unreal Engine 4 technology used in Borderlands 3, and with bespoke PS5 and Series X and Series S editions served up by developer Gearbox once again here, I wondered if there's been any real evolution over Borderlands 3's use of these consoles. Are the frame rates more tightly locked at 60 FPS in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands resolution mode? And what of the other mode, the 120Hz performance mode on PS5 and Series X? And lastly, how do the next-gen consoles compare to each other visually, especially looking at the cutbacks on Series S? Let's find out. So what is the premise of this game? Well, honestly, it's just a fun twist on the Borderlands world. You wake up surrounded by D20s, enemy figurines, a tabletop set, as handcrafted by Tiny Tina, and 2 ally players on each flank. You make a character, choose a class, affinities, attributes, all systems going beyond the usual Borderlands creation tools. And then, you're thrown into a world of imagination, as directed, as narrated by your dungeon master Tiny Tina. It's a game within a game then, and yes, as with so many classic D&D campaigns, we stick to type with a fantasy setting. The wastelands of Borderlands are replaced with idyllic villages, castles, dungeons, even haunted crypts. It doesn't hold back on the silliness, the whimsy, the sense of parody that Gearbox's series is so well known for. But this make-believe setup gives the team carte blanche to break the fourth wall, to even inject wilder ideas into the game. For example, in one moment you'll follow a diamond-encrusted unicorn over a rainbow carpet. In the next, Tiny Tina paints new details into the world, like bridges or whole castle sieges, just as it enters the narration. I like this a lot. With all that said, Borderlands fans will feel right at home with its moment-to-moment action. So by that I mean the shooting mechanics, the mounting, the chest looting, even the way enemies charge at you is so reminiscent of Borderlands, it almost feels like a reskin. And yes, let's not overlook the fact we still bring a whole arsenal of guns to this fantasy world. The key difference, the addition of spells, at least mixes up the flow of combat. Our wizard character here, for instance, immediately gets access to a slowing spell and later more powerful area of effect spells. That's the setup then. In terms of its tech, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has one extra twist though. Unlike the open world roaming in mainline Borderlands games, here we navigate between key areas using a tabletop style world map. Think old school JRPG world maps using a top-down view as you guide a miniaturized version of your character around. A few tricks in the Unreal Engine suite help sell this idea too. You'll see a heavy depth of field creates this lovely tilt-shift photography effect, which again sells this idea that you're just a tiny figurine on a tabletop. You'll see bottle caps and pins dotted around, and all round it's just a pleasant departure from the typical Borderlands approach. As a result, missions are also more focused in design and more linear too. Once you enter an area, you have some lateral movement within a map to explore, but these are more contained experiences, almost like a themed fairground ride. Our focus for today is of course on how the new wave of consoles perform, and in many ways it's a repeat of Borderlands 3. In summary, PS5 and Series X offer 2 graphics modes, a 4K 60 frames per second resolution mode, and also a native 1080p performance mode which unlocks 120Hz support on these consoles. More on that later. Meanwhile, surprise surprise, Series S has no graphics toggle at all. In comparison, let's focus on the 4K resolution modes on PS5 and Series X compared to the one default way to play on Series S. The actual metrics after pixel counting shows a dynamic resolution setup in place on all 3, even if the target is of course quite different. So PS5 and Series X, for example, run with a dynamic 4K, dropping at lowest to 3200 by 1800 in taxing scenes. And as for Series S, 1440p is the target. in this case dropping to 1706 by 960 at lowest. Numbers in between are possible too, but this is the typical range for all three. And yes, close-ups zooming by 4 times really shows PS5 and Series X pulling ahead in overall clarity. Keeping with the comparisons, are there any other differences besides resolution? Well, a couple. For the PS5 versus Series X comparison, there's really nothing to split the two. Textures, grass density, effects are all equally matched, and the resolution too uses a similar range, of course. The real difference is with Series S, which sees detail cut back in a few spots. So let's just dial into the Xbox comparison. Series S versus X on its resolution mode. Right away you'll see grass density is dropped a setting for Series S. The result is honestly still very acceptable in isolation, and no question I enjoyed the playthrough. In comparison though, yeah, absolutely, grass density is chopped to leave more patches in the ground. I'd be hard pressed to call it a big issue. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands focuses on these resplendent grassy areas from the start, and for Series S to target 60 FPS here, a trade had to be made. Otherwise, there's signs of shadow detail also taking a hit on Series S on the floor ahead, and especially in the world map. But beyond the resolution, the grass density, and the shadows, there's not really much to split these three consoles. In terms of every other setting then, Series S holds up well. The real downside, I guess, as is becoming such a trend, the lack of graphics mode options in Series S's menus. For PS5 and Series X, the ability to hit 4K and 60 FPS in resolution mode logically taps into the more powerful, more performant GPUs of each machine. Expected advantage there, but then they also each offer this performance mode as an extra. Performance mode drops the native resolution to 1920 by 1080 on PS5 and Series X, typically fixed at 1080p as far as I've tested. And as we'll get to, it makes 60 FPS performance much more consistent, especially useful for split screen. Even more crucially, it unlocks a 120Hz option for PS5 and Series X, not present on Series S. Just as we saw with Borderlands 3, 120Hz lets us play at double the refresh, and it's a shame to again not see the feature on all three platforms. Next up, the performance tests. On balance, all three platforms hit 60 FPS a majority of the time, so let's start with that as the baseline. With PS5 and Series X set to the resolution mode, it gets you a dynamic 4K image and mostly smooth frame rates at 60 FPS, except, just as with Borderlands 3, there are pockets of drops at times. In both machines, you'll spot these occasionally jarring lurches into the high 50s. It happens just as alpha effects fill the screen, during gunfire for example, or even when turning the camera rapidly. Hardly the worst case scenario then, but these drops do stick out in the heat of action. Now to my eyes, this goes for PS5 and Series X in equal amounts, long stretches of 60 FPS, but then a sudden, if small spike that interrupts the momentum a bit. PS5 and Series X on the resolution mode hold up well then. It's not perfect, and variable refresh rate support, VRR, on Series X comes to the rescue for these moments where frames drop, which is sadly right now a missing feature on PS5. Now, if we switch over to the Series S version, it's clear we're in a similar ballpark overall. Yes, the resolution drops to a dynamic 1440p with pruned back foliage and shadow settings, but on the whole, it's still largely a 60 FPS experience, again interrupted by brief lurches just on firing a gun or hitting a big explosion. Now, the regularity of these drops is sadly a bit higher for Series S, I found. I mean, even standing in front of this portal, it's dropping quite significantly under 60 FPS. And also, big battles tend to push the frame rate under 60 FPS a touch more often too. This is the worst performing option just by a margin, and so it's a shame there's no alternative performance mode to smooth over these drops. Again though, with Series S you do at least have VR support as an option with the right TV connected anyway. That's the general outline of performance, except there's a bit of an oversight playing just solo. Split screen play is a hugely welcome extra for Borderlands, and it returns for Tiny Tina, allowing up to 4 players in split screen on PS5 and Series X here. The catch? Well, playing on resolution mode on either system tanks performance to under 60 FPS far more often. 2 viewpoints, more firepower, equals more drops. Let's just use PS5 as an example. Even an interior battle has us well into the 50 to 60 FPS range, so long as we have the 4K resolution mode selected. And that's exactly where the other performance mode comes in use. Hopping to the menus for a second, and swapping over to the performance mode on a 60Hz display completely evens out the frame rate to a flat 60. It's a hugely welcome addition and works on Series X too. And of course, for solo play, it does the same job. All those momentary drops are evened out to a perfect 60 FPS, though yes, you drop the resolution to a native 1080p in doing so. The performance mode has 2 purposes then, a smoother 60 FPS on 60Hz TVs, but also 120Hz gameplay if your TV supports it. On PS5 and Series X, this gives us options, and especially where split screen is concerned, it's a huge advantage. Speaking of which, how does the 120Hz performance hold up? Well, here we have PS5 an example, and generally speaking, it's sticking closely to the target. Though, just as with Borderlands 3, drops are pretty inevitable once the action kicks off. We're getting a range of 90 to 120 FPS on PS5, with occasional spikes into the 80 FPS range just playing solo. Adding more players in split screen will push this mode to its limits too, so yes, once again, there's a big need for VRR support, in this case on PS5, but on balance we're getting huge chunks of play at that max 120 FPS. Frame times run as low as 8.7 milliseconds, and all round it feels much better to play, if still not quite perfect. Switching over to the Series X on its 120Hz mode, it's a similar story. The range goes from 90 to 120 FPS, and while direct comparisons to PS5 are difficult given how variable gameplay is, I will say readings are on average higher on Series X. It's rare to see dips into the 90 FPS range even, in this Castle Siege for example, let alone the 80 FPS region possible on PS5. Add in the option for VR support, and Series X has a definite advantage. Now, the visibility of frame rate drops is hardly a deal breaker on PS5, I will say. Even between 90 and 120 FPS, the drops just aren't as perceptible as a sub 60 FPS drop would be. It's just on Series X, these drops are less visible overall. Fewer drops, less significant drops, and VRR support all work in its favour. But still, both platforms put in an impressive delivery of the game here. A final word on loading times. Series X may have an advantage at 120Hz, but much like Borderlands 3, PS5 appears to lead in loading speeds. So the quick test, going from the tabletop map to the Queen's Gate area takes PS5 8 seconds to load, up against the 11 seconds on both Xbox consoles. So Series S comes out marginally ahead of X in this case, but honestly, it's just by a whisker, and the two are largely interchangeable across the game. All three put in solid loading speeds overall though, with PS5 just edging out the competition. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a surprising twist on the Borderlands concept. Gearbox takes its chance to inject humour into a new fantasy setting, the world map is charming, and the D&D style upgrades separate it from Borderlands' usual approach. And yet, it's still at its core a Borderlands game once you start pulling the trigger. Technically, it largely takes the fundamentals of Borderlands 3 too, in its delivery on PS5, Series X and S. The lack of options for Series S is once again a bit of a sore point, and I wish we'd seen another option to salvage performance, even if it does mean lowering the resolution or even more visual settings. The 120Hz modes on PS5 and Series X, meanwhile, are a big success. Either of these versions come highly recommended, with the recommendation also that you play split screen with the performance mode enabled. A job well done on an oddly charming spin-off then. But that's all I have time for today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.